Hello, my name is Nicholas Morton, and in this video I'm going to provide a strategic overview of the Near East during the medieval period with a particular focus on the Crusades. And to begin with, I'm going to be thinking about deserts. So towards the east of this map you can see the Syrian Desert. Now of course deserts are very difficult areas for armies or indeed merchant caravans to cross, and so if you want to enter this region from the east, then really you're going to have to swing north, about in a line with Aleppo, crossing the river Euphrates, and then swinging down towards Damascus, Egypt, or indeed to the coast. But that's one key point. If you want to enter this region, it's going to have to be in the north. There are some roads that cross the desert, but these aren't really practicable for large forces or indeed for large numbers of merchants. Now the Syrian Desert extends south into the Arabian Desert, and here too there is very little military activity. There are some communities in this area, most famously the Bedouin, but notably there's very few raids, very few attacks by any faction into the Arabian Desert out of the core region shown in this map. In 1182, the ruler of Transjordan, Reynald of Chatillon, staged a naval raid into the Red Sea region. He's also known to have conducted a few overland raids at around this time as well, but that's about the extent of the military activity passing into that area out of, say, the Jordan area. Another crucial consideration is the ridge of high ground that extends north to south, parallel to the coast but a little way inland. Now this area of high ground in some areas is essentially hilly or craggy territory, but particularly in the area of Lebanon it rises up into some very high mountains. And so that area of high ground, which is just sort of 10-20 miles inland from the sea, it's very hard for armies to cross, and even where there are roads, those roads are often very vulnerable to ambush and attack. Now, particularly in the north and around areas like the county of Tripoli, which of course was essentially the coastal strip between the mountains and the sea in what today would be sort of northern Lebanon, southern Syria, the mountains form a blockage for any army trying to attack from its eastern borders. So those mountains are very important strategically. But there are gaps in the mountain chain. So while there are mountains that extend across much of Tripoli's eastern border, there is something called the Holmes Gap a little way to the north, and this provides perhaps the most obvious invasion route into the county of Tripoli. And of course, because there's only really a few good invasion routes into the county of Tripoli, and that is perhaps the most obvious one, that means that it's very heavily fortified. So you may have heard of the castle of Crac de Chevalier, but this castle is very much set up to defend and protect that particular gap in the mountain chain. There are other fortifications and fortified towns in the area as well, and the county of Tripoli doesn't just defend on that frontier, it also conducts a fair amount of its expansionist warfare on that front as well. So you can see that that mountain barrier, but then the gap at the Holmes Gap in the north, is tremendously important. And that area of high ground after the Holmes Gap then continues further north towards the Principality of Antioch, and in that sort of mountainous region you get various other communities who value the protection of that high ground area. And so it's in this region that partway through the 12th century the Nizaris, who in the west were nicknamed the Assassins, their small territories were located, and there are other communities such as the Alawite communities who are also in that area too, who value the seclusion and defensibility of that particular area. Likewise, when those mountains begin to sort of subside and move and change into hill country in the northern areas of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the area just to the north of the Sea of Galilee, again you can see a substantial number of fortresses in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, because again that creates a situation of strategic vulnerability, and so castles like Safad, Belvoir, to name but a few, are in that area. Another key strategic consideration is the question of agricultural land. The main point being, as I mentioned in a previous video, there isn't much of it. Now the Egyptian Nile Delta is by far and away the best arable land in the area, and a lot of the arable crops and therefore the grain required by people across the Near East comes from Egypt. That, of course, is not just about food supply, it's also very important geopolitically and as a military target as well, people wanting to control both the food supply and the money it brings with it. Other important agricultural areas include the coastal strip down the Levantine coast, which is tremendously important because it has quite a high precipitation, which is very suitable for agriculture, not just for the local food supply, but also to raise foodstuffs that can be sold elsewhere. For example, during the history of the Crusader states, a great deal of sugarcane is grown on that coastal strip, which is then refined into sugar and sold elsewhere. So that coastal strip is very, very important. Other areas of agriculture include the Cilician Plains in the north and also the Hauran region to the south of Damascus. And again, many of the wars of this era focus either on the control of these agricultural regions or the destruction of crops, the idea being to deny your opponent the use of that agricultural land and therefore the ability to feed their population and to draw tax revenue from it. So this is all very important from a geostrategic perspective. Okay, another important matter concerns communications, because many of the empires of the medieval period, the Ayyubids would be one example, the Mamluks later on would be another, have territories both in Egypt but also in Syria as well. And one of the key considerations for them is ensuring communications between their Egyptian lands and their Syrian lands, which normally start around Damascus. And so if you look at this map, you'll see that there is that big gap. If you want to get armies, traders, emissaries from Egypt to Damascus, they've got to cross the Sinai Desert and then swing up north to reach Damascus. Now, when the Kingdom of Jerusalem was reasonably strong, it tried to block those communications. This is particularly true in the later 12th century, which created a big problem for the Ayyubid Empire. So that raises another question. How do you strategically control that communications route? And the answer to that can really be seen in Saladin's repeated attempts to conquer the fortresses of Kirak and Monreal in the Transjordan region, because these fortresses really were the major blockage to those communications. The Sinai Desert, which is just to the east of Egypt, also represented a major problem for Egyptian armies trying to operate further north. And so, famously, in 1177, Saladin tried to invade the southern margins of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and was then very badly defeated at the Battle of Montgisard. Now, the problem with this is that he had no place of retreat. So when his army withdrew after the battle, he had to recross the Sinai Desert, all the time being chased not just by the Franks of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but by the Bedouin as well, until he got back to Egypt. So he suffered very heavy casualties. And so this is another really important consideration. In order for Egypt to make its armies work further north in the Levantine region, it needs to cross the Sinai Desert, which is a logistical feat in its own right, but it also makes it very difficult to withdraw once you've crossed the desert in the first instance. And certainly for the first half of the 12th century, when Egypt was ruled by the Fatimid dynasty, the Fatimids really benefited from having control over the city of Ascalon, because the city of Ascalon gave them a forward operating base from which they could stage attacks, but which they could also fall back upon if they needed to. Another question is that of grazing. Now, there are many nomadic communities in the Near East, the Bedouin, Turkmen, among others, and of course the main interest for them is grazing, because they've got large herds, whether that's of sheep or goats or horses, and they need to make sure they have enough grazing for all those animals. And so grazing can also become a major geopolitical consideration. And there is some good grazing in the Near East, but it's not found everywhere, and so that too makes it an important geopolitical consideration. There's some fairly good grazing around the Sea of Galilee, particularly to the north and to the east. There's also quite good grazing in the Holmes Gap and quite a lot more further north, but that too could be an important consideration. Another mountain chain staying in the north, which was very important for the kingdom of Cilician Armenia, was the Amanus and also the Taurus Mountains, who sort of bracketed the kingdom on its eastern and northern frontiers, creating a barrier which helped to protect it from external invasion. So another example then of mountains forming important political barriers. But perhaps the number one consideration strategically for this entire area, which was to be a preoccupation for many commanders, rulers and armies throughout this period, is the control of cities. Many of the cities in the Near East were very large, Aleppo and Damascus and Cairo being perhaps the clearest examples, but also the coastal cities of Acre, Tyre, Tripoli, Latakia. These are all major cities. They've got very large populations, which makes them very hard to conquer. They've also got very important markets, and they're centres of trade for caravans from all sorts of different directions. And this makes them crucial to hold. They bring an enormous revenue to their rulers. But of course, those rulers have also got to conquer them in the first place in many instances, and then remain in control. And maintaining control over a large urban population can prove a challenge in its own right. And yet it is control over these cities that was so important to many of the policies and strategies of this era. And then there's also spiritual sites. Now, it goes without saying that Jerusalem was enormously important, not just as a place of spiritual importance and of reverence for many different faiths, but also as a political target as well. The First Crusade famously conquered Jerusalem with a very brutal conquest in 1099, and of course many other rulers conquered or reconquered Jerusalem as the years went by, or indeed had the ambition of doing so. And this makes Jerusalem, but also many of the other spiritual locations of the Near East, extremely important from a geopolitical perspective as well. Okay, well, I do hope you found this talk helpful. Please have a look at the other videos in the collection. Thank you.